In our last module, we're going to take a look at some ethical issues that come up for morticians, coroners, and also morticians who happen to also work as coroners. One thing that's sort of interesting about this topic is that despite the fact that there are a lot of similarities between um, this field and other fields where we do have really significant codes of ethics and professional standards and things like that, there's sort of a surprising lack of that sort of thing when it comes to morticians and coroners. What we find, and what I had you guys read, and the reason I had you guys read some of the codes of ethics for morticians in Ohio and things like that, what we find are sort of vague suggestions about how morticians and coroners ought to conduct themselves. Often these codes are not binding, or they're sort of contingent on being a member of particular professional associations. We'll look later at some of the standards of conduct from the National Funeral Directors Association. One of the things that it says in the description of that code of conduct is that this applies to members of that association. Others should not sort of see it as binding for them. So unlike, for example, medicine, where we have the American Medical Association providing a widely established, agreed on, professionally binding code of conduct, we don't have anything like that for morticians and coroners. And you might think that that's really surprising given some of our own thoughts about what morticians and coroners ought to do and how they ought to conduct themselves. Whenever sort of improper conduct by these folks comes up in the news, it's always seen as shocking, and my God, I can't believe that any mortician would act that way. And yet we find it, and it turns out that there aren't the same kinds of professional binding codes of conduct that we see in other fields where we have strong feelings. Okay, so what we want to do here is look a little more closely at these codes of ethics, and then a little bit later on we're going to look at specific issues that might come up for morticians and that also might come up for coroners, and especially when morticians serve as coroners. But I think a good place to start is just with our own intuitions, our own thoughts about how we think morticians ought to conduct themselves. And so here are a few just general rules I think we probably all already agree to. I mean, we probably think that morticians should be professional in some way. It should be, this shouldn't be something that people sort of flutter in and out of. It should be something that involves a lot of commitment, a lot of training and skill. A mortician should be more like a physician or a lawyer, and less like a barista or a sandwich artist, for example. This is a profession. This isn't a job. And we think that people in professions should conduct themselves in particular ways, and that probably applies to morticians. We probably also think that morticians ought to show respect for the dead, although we're gonna have to think more about what that actually means. Morticians most likely should also honor the wishes of the family and the deceased. We probably think that's really important. And many of you probably have some notion or agree with this basic thought that morticians ought to treat the dead with dignity. Although much like showing respect, we need to know exactly what that is. And what's going to be sort of problematic and tricky about some of this stuff is that concepts like respect and dignity usually apply to living persons. And it's not entirely clear what it means to show respect for a dead person, or to show respect for the body of a dead person, because that's really who morticians are working with. And a lot of these basic thoughts that we probably mostly agree with, just intuitively and without sort of worrying too much about it. This all sort of sounds right probably to most of you. I think it's worthwhile, as we look more closely at the codes of conduct that we have been reading and that we're going to sort of think more about, I think we can sort these codes into a few basic categories. The first of these is what I would call matters of courtesy. So these are going to be non-moral obligations that are intended to show proper regard for the family and the fact that they've recently suffered a loss. Notice here that the target of matters of courtesy is really the family rather than the dead person or the body of the dead person. So this might include, and this comes up in some of the literature I had you look at. Not giving death notifications over the phone, um, giving warning to the family when the deceased's appearance is going to be shocking, like if they were in a car accident or they were shot or something like that. You want to let the family know, hey, Bob is he's not gonna look like what you remember because he was substantially injured, or something like that. Also, closing autopsy incisions prior to the embalming process. That's just sort of makes the body look better when it's presented for funeral services. It's not something that's really that's really sort of medically necessary. It doesn't make a difference for the embalming process, but it is sort of less troubling to see incisions following autopsies that are actually closed as opposed to just sort of being left open. And notice none of this really benefits the corpse or the deceased person. This is all really for the family. So that's one kind of ethical obligation that we might see, or we might think applies to coroners, and that seems to come up in their codes of conduct. We also see some rules that have to do with conflicts of interest. Now, these are going to be both moral and legal obligations. And mostly what these are designed to do is prevent morticians from benefiting sort of improperly in virtue of their position within the mortuary science and bereavement industry, so to speak. So this is going to apply to coroners when we're talking about recommending any particular funeral home. And that'll come up again when we talk about conflicts of interest for mortician coroners. Many morticians are also coroners, and so many codes of ethics say, look, when you're in your coroner role, you cannot give recommendations for any particular funeral home, because for any mortician coroner, it's going to be natural to recommend your own funeral home. What else would you do? So that we have these codes of conduct say, look, morticians, so when you're acting as the coroner, you cannot offer any recommendation to your home or anywhere else, funeral home or anywhere else. That's not something that we allow, and it's to prevent conflicts of interest. Similarly, when you're a mortician serving in your coroner role, if your vehicle has signage indicating an affiliation with a particular funeral home, certain codes of ethics, I believe the Ohio Code of Ethics for Morticians and Coroners says this. You should cover any signage indicating that you are associated with a particular funeral home. And the thought here is we don't want anything that implies a recommendation. We don't want explicit recommendations, but we also don't want signage suggesting or implying a particular recommendation. And finally, soliciting or offering certain kinds of services in exchange for referrals is also regarded as inappropriate conduct. And that's going to be true whether you're a mortician or a coroner. So we don't want morticians doing things like, hey, bring your aunt to my funeral home. I'll give you a discount if you sort of refer your friends, or use me, or agree to use me or my funeral home for other sort of future deaths that may occur in your family or in the community. We don't want that kind of stuff going on. I mean, it's highly problematic in that it seems to give the mortician sort of undue benefit. We want people to feel like they can freely choose whatever services they want. And a lot of the codes of conduct, the specific rules in these codes of conduct has to do with protecting the family's ability to choose and sort of make free choices without being influenced or coerced in certain ways. And especially when you think about the fact that we're talking about a time of life that's going to be pretty emotional and psychologically difficult for the family. They've just lost a loved one, now they have to make all these decisions. And so a lot of these codes of conduct are interested in or directed at really limiting sort of manipulation and coercion, even whether it's intentional or malicious or not. It's just sort of trying to avoid even the appearance of that sort of thing. Alright, I think a third category that we might notice for these codes of ethics is going to pertain to matters of legality. Now we're going to talk more about this later because some of the legal requirements may surprise you, but this is basically going to pertain to legal obligations concerning various local, state, and federal governments, what they demand, their demands with regard to licensing, record-keeping, reporting. One thing that's specifically mentioned in the codes of conduct we looked at is that mortician coroners need to think about the possibility that next of kin is not the person who the deceased has designated as their decision maker. They may want a close friend to do it, maybe an ex-wife instead of their current wife. In speaking with a couple of morticians, I've heard of this sort of thing happening, where the deceased actually specified, not their current wife, like their ex-wife or someone like that, or their neighbor instead of their spouse. And there are a variety of reasons someone might do this. Maybe that they just don't want to put their current spouse in that kind of position. It may be that they feel that their neighbor or their prior spouse knows certain things about them that their current spouse doesn't. And there are a lot of ways that we can understand this sort of thing. It need not be sort of malicious or soap opera-esque. Matters of legality also include maintaining required licenses. Morticians have to have licenses. There are separate licenses for embalming. Facilities have to be licensed in proper ways. And finally, there are all sorts of record-keeping requirements, and those are all locally and at the state level, and then at the federal level, those are all sort of established. And those are things that morticians have to be aware of. The last category of ethical rules, I guess, is the best way to put it, is going to fall under the concept of deceased rights. And these are going to be, again, both moral and legal obligations. And these concern the sort of treatment that the body of the deceased is entitled to. So, whereas matters of courtesy really apply to the family, and conflicts of interest are about preventing certain kinds of undue benefit, matters of legality are just sort of a hodgepodge of those things. Deceased rights specifically apply to how the body is allowed to be treated or ought to be treated. And these tend to be very vague. We get things like care for the deceased person with the highest respect and dignity. See, there's closely tracking our sort of intuitions and initial thoughts about how we want morticians and coroners to behave. This kind of language actually appears in the official codes of conduct. We hear things like treat the body with proper care and dignity, properly cover the body at all times. And not all the rights and requirements that are mentioned in the literature that we looked at fit neatly into these categories, so there may be a need for additional ones. The point here is just that we want to, in moving hopefully towards something like a code of conduct or a code of ethics for morticians and coroners, we want to start by sort of codifying this a little bit and sort of arranging it in a way that makes it coherent, that helps us to understand the competing and just differing, not necessarily competing, but differing obligations and sources of those obligations that morticians and coroners have to deal with. And we're going to look more closely at this notion of deceased rights in just a minute, because I think you're going to see some very surprising things once we sort of dig a little bit deeper. But before you do that, go ahead and take care of the question. It is about differences between matters of courtesy and deceased rights. I've tried to push on a couple of these just in talking about them, but you might go back and just review those slides as well. And then we'll move on to thinking more closely about this notion of deceased rights.